I'm going to talk about Phoenix. Quick survey. Who's used Phoenix before? So half of you. Who's got a Phoenix app in production? 3, 4, 5, 6. Cool. Who's played around with 1.3? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, awesome. If I say anything wrong, let me know. I was kind of surprised. I thought there was a bit more to 1.3, and there isn't that much. It's kind of simple. So what I'm going to do for those who haven't used Phoenix, which is maybe half of you, I'll give you a very quick intro into Phoenix. What is it? It's basically Elixir's most popular web framework. It's basically Rails for Elixir. The beauty of it, it's only about 60 files, and there's not a lot to it. It might seem complicated when you first look at it, but it's actually kind of not. All the action happens in plug. And plug is part of the Elixir core framework. That's part of the core library. But everything in Phoenix is essentially a plug. So controllers are just collections of actions, and actions are just function plugs. We'll look at what that is in a minute, but routers end up being plugs. Endpoint, the entire app actually ends up turning into a plug. So plug basically means it's super composable. You can make plugs out of plugs, and that's kind of like rack in Ruby land. It's like a reasonably straightforward functional HTTP abstraction. It's super simple. We'll see some examples. So basically Phoenix gains most of its flexibility from using plug, and its simplicity from using plug. I can't say enough good things about plug. It's pretty awesome. And it just makes web request response round trips really easy to reason about. So like I said, Phoenix web apps are actually plugs themselves, so they lend themselves to composability at a high level. But Phoenix is basically just a bunch of convenience macros on top of plug. So that's what it all boils down to. So why might you want to use Phoenix? Why is it so awesome? Why is everyone raving about it? It's ridiculously fast, really simple to get into. It's very robust. Uses all the OTP, Erlang principles that we've been banging on about endlessly. Like I said, it embraces and extends plug, which is super simple. Like, it can't get any simpler than that. And it's pretty familiar to Rails refugees and anyone else that's familiar with what Rails has done. And a lot of web frameworks have copied Rails, so it's probably going to seem pretty familiar. I like to think of it as Rails the good parts. It takes all of the good things about Rails and chucks away all the bad things. And that's great. So, I said plug. What is a plug? They're super simple. This is plugs described as simply as I can make it. So essentially what plug does, whether it's a function plug or a module plug, and we'll see examples of really simple plugs, but what it does is it takes this structure that represents the entire HTTP round trip. So all of the parameters that you get passed in, the response, so the whole HTTP request and response. It's one big giant structure. It's probably a bit much to look at it. So I'm not going to show you a slide of it, but it has everything that you need and would expect to be in there about the request and the response. So then the plug basically does some work. So either it transforms the con and returns a new one, or it does some side effect kind of thing, like logging out something or sending some message somewhere else to do some kind of side effect. You might be recording metrics or timing stuff or what have you. But that's probably the only reason you would not return and do something to the con object and return a new one. And then that's it. You do some stuff to the con or a side effect and return a new plug con. And that's it. Super simple. So here's some examples. So essentially plugs are can be as simple as functions. Here we see the hello world plug. It takes a con object. We can give it options, but we're not doing that in this case. So we're ignoring those. And essentially what we're doing is saying put status OK, which turns into a 200. There's a big map. You can customize that if you want. But the standard is all of the HTTP response codes. And then we send the response hello world. And that's it. That's the hello world in plug land. If we wanted to do something to, let's say, the response header, then we can essentially use the second JSON header plug, take the con, and we're just changing the response type. Pretty simple. We can do a module plug, which is a little bit more complicated, but still super simple. We refer to them as modules, and it has a call function to do what the function plug was doing. So putting status OK and sending the response hello world, and then you've got an optional compile time initialization that you can set up configuration for what that does. So you might want to do something else based on some setup options. And that's it, that's plug. So Phoenix is all based on this really simple concept. So this is the JSON header module plug. Again, same thing, it's just inside a module. How do I do that? Everyone get that? Is that simple as I promised it would be? Cool, so this gets more interesting when you want to build pipelines, and pipelines are plugs built out of other plugs. So this is a key concept in plug, and this is how you build your router essentially in Phoenix. You're basically building your entire HTTP request handler based out of pipelines or plugs. So what we're doing here is essentially building a pipeline. So we say use plug builder. That's the standard plug pipeline builder. It basically turns other plugs, a collection of other plugs, into a plug that you can plug in somewhere else. So you can make pipelines of plugs, have other pipelines of plugs all the way down. So here we've got something that logs out the HTTP request. We've got a hello thing, which is basically down here. We'll look at that in a sec. We've got some configuration options there. We say make hello world turn into an uppercase. We can pull in plugs from other places. Essentially, it just has to be a function in the local module. And you give it an atom, and that calls that plug. Pretty simple. So here we've got atom hello, and this is calling this function here. All we're doing is saying if you've got ops upper set to true, then uppercase world. And then send the response. You've got a different kind of function here than we had before, but it's the same thing. Send a 200 with that body. Pretty simple.
That send response function, where does that actually come from?
So, yeah, good question. And I was going to put that in, however, it sort of made the code a bit noisy. They're all plug con functions. So anything that you don't know where it's coming from, that has something to do with the con object as the first thing, is probably a plug con module.
When you're connecting to the plug.server, that's including one of those modules, and one of those modules has that function.
So that's probably where some of the magic in Phoenix might come from, is the fact that it's, in most cases, implicitly including plug con, so you can just do all that stuff. So if you're not sure, and it's got a con as the first argument, it is probably a plug, and it's probably, if it's not your plug, then it will be essentially something from plug con. And there's a whole bunch of functions there for doing various things. All right, so that was the intro to plug. Everyone got that? I'm going to do the fastest tour of Phoenix that you can imagine. Let's go. So just a note, all of these are using the new Phoenix 1.3 style. And this is actually code snipped out from the Sydney Elixir website. So off we go. Kind of the entry point of any Phoenix application is the endpoint. That doesn't make sense, entry, end. Anyway, that's the thing that's mounted as your web application. And yeah, plug.con is being dragged in here somewhere, most likely. So what we're doing is we're saying we use the Phoenix endpoint, and Phoenix does create this for you, by the way. It kind of comes in for free, and this is mostly unchanged, I think. But you can add in, this is basically a plug pipeline, just like Plug Builder was, and you can put in your own stuff in there. So if you want to measure how long your requests are taking, or do some extra logging to somewhere else, you can do all of that stuff. Basically, plug static is probably the thing worth pointing out, is that's serving all of your static content from basically prove static. And it grabs all of those things, and you can define what you want to serve up from that, and you really should gzip it. Why is that false? I think that's falsified by default, so we should change that. Anyway, we've got plug logger, plug parsers to do any form manipulation. So we encode multi-part forms or JSON forms. And then the key part of this to understand is that we're calling the router. which is again another pipeline of plugs. So again, we're already going from a pipeline of plugs to another pipeline of plugs, and the router is where you're going to do all your stuff. So here's the router. This is like a little snip, but it's pretty simple. Basically, we're doing this here, import the web, and you'll do this in a lot of Phoenix places. It's a bunch of macros that just do a bunch of imports for you. And you can modify what gets included as well in the web, which I didn't include as an example, but it's worth looking at web. It has all of these inclusions for you about what it's importing, what it's requiring, what's going to be available to you in each thing, like a router or a controller or what have you. So the main thing is this, like the scope here is Elixir Sydney Web. We pipe through the browser pipeline, so we can have API stuff that pipes through a different series of plugs. But here what we're doing is we want to accept HTML. And the main part of the application is at the root of the application, we're getting, the root folder, and we're just sending that to a controller module and an index action. And as I said, controllers are just modules of functions that are plug functions. So hopefully that makes sense, given that I've introduced what plug functions are. So it's kind of just like Rails, but it's also super simple like plug. There's nothing really magical about any of these things. They're just plugs. So here we go, more. You can do all the resources stuff, but this is just simple pages basically. We can get meetups. We go to the meetups action of the page controller. And here's an example at the bottom with a slug for a meetup. And we can just pass that param called slug into that action. So let's see some more stuff. Here's the controller. It's basically the page controller. Again, we're using the web module, and we're grabbing the controller piece out of that, which is again another function that has macros in it, to basically do some aliasing and it's importing, just to give you the stuff that you need, so there isn't much code in there. And this is it. Like an action is just same as in Rails, it's just a function, but it's also a plug. And we're rendering con and just telling it which HTML template to go and pick up. So the only magic there is it adds.eex on the end, which is basically Elixir's version of ERB. So here we're passing the meetup. And the other nice thing about the controllers and views relationship in Phoenix is that everything's super explicit. There's no magical, passing in the instance variables from a view or a controller down into the view. So everything's kind of explicit. If you don't pass it in, you don't get it available to you. But other than that, it does work like Rails. So that's pretty simple. We're not doing anything with the params there. If we did want to match the slug, let's say, there was an example previously, we would just have a map that says slug is slug, and then we'd look up slug in our application to go and give us that. So this is the application layout. It's just HTML. The main thing that you want to look at is the render, the view module, and the view template, and passing in all of the assigns, which is all of the things that data that's been passed to you. Again, that's another plug concept. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. So that should be familiar to everyone. Every web framework has something like that. Here's a view template. All we're doing is just rendering a div, and then inside of that div, we're rendering a partial. And unlike in Rails, partials do have to have the underscores in front. They're not magical. And you do have to explicitly pass everything that you want down in that partial through. Otherwise, it will not be passed. Any questions about that stuff? I think that's pretty much it. I think the thing I did miss out in terms of a slide was for each controller or resource, there's what's called a view file. Basically, what happens is your templates get compiled down to render functions in the view. And often, that's a bit of a confusion point for people not familiar with Phoenix, because essentially what happens is you end up with an empty view file, and it's like, I have to have it, why is it there? Essentially, what's happening is all of your templates, your EEX HTML templates, are being compiled into just render functions that are pattern matched. And that's it. You could write those render functions yourself and not write any HTML templates, but yeah, that's pretty much it. And that's most of Phoenix. Did I miss anything major? Because I don't think there's too much more. Yeah, there's channels, but that's sort of advanced. Yeah, like channels are the thing I'm not going to cover at all, simply because they get complicated. But this is as a web framework for just doing normal web stuff. Request response, that's pretty much it.
So you briefly mentioned views, but views and like the Rails equivalent might be like a percentage level layer, where you might have like presentational logic, where you might get data from your DB or some other source. You want to prepare to be different with helpers or something. But it may also be like your serializer level if you're using like JSON API or model serializers where that you get data structures and put them into JSON. So like the views are like presenters or serializers to a degree.
Yep. So yeah, views are also where you'd put your helpers and so forth. And yeah, they sort of take on a different role if you are doing API kind of stuff. I'm not going to cover that, but that kind of gives you the basics if you haven't seen Phoenix before. So here's the sort of what I was really aiming to talk about, which is what's new in Phoenix 1.3. And it sounds like a lot of stuff, but it's really not that much. Basically, the big message is, or the big change is moving web inside of lib. So previously, web was its own special directory. I think there was a reason inside the Elixir compiler why it had to be separate due to code reloading, but they fixed that now, so it can just go back into lib where all of your Elixir application code goes, and now it's not special anymore. So basically, the whole Phoenix thing has been banging on about, well, avoiding what Rails does, which is lead you towards making a big monolith and your application is your web app, and there is nothing else in your domain and model and your actual, the thing that does the business logic, I guess. Your domain model is actually part of your web application. Phoenix is trying to really guide you towards not doing that. So what you should have is your application with a web presentation layer. And so all of this change is really trying to push you down that path. And all of the new generators essentially just guide you towards putting code in the right place, so that when you build a bigger app, and it does get bigger, it will not be painful to work with. So basically, there's a new thing called contexts. We can probably talk about that a little bit. I'm not sure exactly how we use them, but I've probably got some ideas. So essentially, they help you isolate your web interface from your domain model. And you might have multiple separate bounded contexts in your domain model. So yeah. Key messages, again, Phoenix is just the web presentation layer of your application. And your application means that if you took the web presentation layer off, you should be able to kind of access it through a CLI or some other kind of GUI, maybe even, just muck around and do all the things that your application could do through the REPL, like through IEX. So you should be able to do all your stuff to your application without that. And that's the separation we're aiming for. So your application needs to exist separately to that. All of these things are just guiding you down that path. So you would have probably seen this if you've seen Chris McCord's Lone Star Elixir talk, which is worth watching. He just goes through all of the reasoning for all of this. But basically, web's gone, and that's moving inside lib, and we're not using the word model again. For all those reasons I just said, Phoenix ain't your application. So what does it look like? Basically, this is what kind of basic structure you get from Mix Phoenix.new in 1.2. Notice your node modules are on the outside, and you've got this special web directory at that level. All of the normal stuff just goes inside there, including static, which is where all of your static assets are. This is the new version. I wish Dexat had a nice way of putting them side by side, but basically assets is its own directory. Node modules and your package JSON will live inside of that, and your branch config will live inside there. All of your static assets live inside there. And then web is basically inside lib, inside your own application. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Everything else kind of stays the same. So the main premise is your app lives there and the web interface is just an extra thing. It's separate. So that's all this is trying to achieve. And it's not that real, it's not that big an upgrade. There's not that much different happening. So it all is just guidance and Rails to help you down the right path. Haha, Rails. So this is what essentially all of the Phoenix mix commands look like in 1.2. Most of you should be familiar with it if you've used it before. There's nothing too dramatic in there. These are the new ones. So you've got a way to clean out digests. You've got generating ecto schemas and migration files. I'm not actually sure quite what that does, but once we play with it a bit more, we'll find out. The big thing is generating contexts. Again, well, this is what we're going to talk about right now. So basically this means better design decisions. And they're a little confusing. I'm really not sure of quite when you use it in a smallish app, but they're going to be super helpful to prevent, the giant ball of mud coming down the track when your application gets big and you didn't refactor it on the way. So this is kind of a picture of the traditional domain-driven design, Eric Evans' famous book. It's a big book. Most people probably say they've read it and haven't. There's a shorter version. I think there's a DDD distilled or something. Yeah, most people haven't read that either. Anyway, bounded context is the idea that you've got different domain models for different contexts within a domain. And there's sort of, dotted lines around them. And customers in a sales context means something different to a customer in a support context, for example. Same with products. You want different things from those models. They're kind of the same thing, but they do different stuff within different contexts. And that's, I think, I haven't seen it written explicitly what context is aiming for. It's about describing a domain-bounded context. Different model names mean different things in different contexts. That's pretty much it. So all it is just a well-named module with well-named functions, and it represents an API boundary to part of your application domain. That's pretty much it. So it shouldn't be too scary. I think, you're probably not going to use it if you've got a small app, basically. This is the commands that you'd run to actually, so when you generate an HTML resource or a JSON resource, you actually have to provide a context. Now that's probably going to be confusing the first time you do this because you're going to be like, what context? What is this? So probably make something up. It's going to force you to do it, but maybe this is your app for a very small app. So I think for the Elixir Sydney app, it's its own context and there probably won't be other ones. And maybe an example is if we wanted to add like a blog where people could just blog about Elixir stuff on the website, that's kind of a different domain to what the meetup part is. And so what we would do is have a blog context and we'd have posts and what have you, and we'd have authors that are still people in our main domain, but in the meetups side of things, we've got speakers and presenters and so forth. So if you can imagine that as a good example of what a context might be in your application, and it's going to depend on your application as well. But that's the idea, is to try and modularize your big application without resorting to, let's say, umbrella apps or having completely separate applications. Does that make sense? Has anyone got any other thoughts on what contexts are and what they might mean and where you might use them? Stan? No thoughts?
It would be confusing, like, how to say, sometimes I've been spending a lot of time just thinking how to separate, let's say, some modules in a very small application, and I ended up pushing all of them into a base context.
And I think that's fine. I think for very small apps, call it, I mean, there should be a default context that you go, I don't want to think about this right now, just leave me alone, because this is tiny and it's not going anywhere big. But, sorry, we're going
Depends on, I think there's certain components of your app you don't want to share. That gives you a clear delineation. So
yeah.
this segment is not shared from the other one. So I mean, it's all kind of based on the, loosely based on the domain-driven design.
Yeah, it's all down to your domain and how you slice it up.
If you're only using one domain within the app, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
If you push past that, you've got different sections of characteristics or separations of concerns, you probably want to, that's where we divide it. But I think initially the way it got.
Are you supposed to make views that have mixes of things from different contexts? Like over here is a little teaser or something that comes over from this other blog area, and you've got your main page contains things from different.
Look, I think that's why you have context versus resorting to making it a completely separate application, is so that you can do that. Because inevitably, if you've got a bunch of little, content things in a website, you're probably going to want to put something in a sidebar, and then you're going to use it across contexts. And so I imagine that's why you have contexts like this. They're very lightweight modules, sort of separation of your different parts of your app. They're sub apps, but without resorting to like giant, seams.
In the directory structure that you showed, I didn't see any representation of the concept of context. When you run these generators, do they embed the context name within the name of the object that they generate?
Let's have a look, actually. I mean, I just made up this example, but
Also, with the app,
let me run it on the actual app and see what happens. How much time we got? We're heading to 9 o'clock. I'm nearly done, so do people want to see what happens when we run that generator?
Yep.
All right, let's do it. So let me just make sure that we're clear. Git status. So this is what it's made here. And you're right, it is just a module and it hasn't done anything magical. It's just added an extra, directory and module to your module chain. So what? Oh, it's a branch. Because we did some ecto stuff and I had to actually then not do that because we weren't finished.
also, I think that the general advice is that modules from different contexts, they shouldn't call each other directly. So, for instance, a user from the sales department shouldn't reach directly a user from the support context. And they should talk to each other through the context boundaries.
Yeah, it's an API boundary.
Yeah, that way the main modules like sales, support, they can become huge very fast.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it, right?
Going back a long time, they're really just like fuses from Fusebox. Like the old.
Don't know what those words mean, but sure.
We're talking web framework from 2000.
Oh, is this Cold Fusion?
So yeah, but they put a program on a different platform.
Right. Yeah, I mean, like Stan said, and you're right, it's basically like an API for talking between subparts of your application. Think of it that way. So you're probably not going to need that in a small app. You probably are going to need it in a bigger app. So, it doesn't seem to affect too much here, but this was an app that we upgraded from 1.2 Phoenix. So the only blog thing that I can see here is the blog post. So we can go have a look at what that looks like.
Yeah, looks like that's the formerly known model.
Yeah, right. So it's made a post, which is just the schema, and it's made a blog context. And this is the API, right? List posts, get posts. So previously what Phoenix generators were doing were actually doing what Rails does, is in your controllers it was calling ecto functions, which is freaking terrible. That's why they're fixing this, because everyone was doing the wrong thing and ignoring the sage advice of Phoenix isn't your application kind of stuff. So now you've got a blog sub-application and that's the API. So if you only have one context, that's cool. That's your API for your app.
So they don't use context, the word context in the actual file name.
No, they don't, but that's what they're calling it.
That's a bit annoying.
Well, I mean, context is a pretty terrible term anyway. It means a lot of things. But it is your sub-app. Maybe they need to come up with better names. I mean, Phoenix 1.3 is not released yet, so maybe they'll come up with a better name, who knows. So that's the summary. Small apps, your app's basically the context, call it whatever you want. You may only use one context. For big apps, break up your app into different domain contexts, essentially. And it stops you making from a giant monolith or a big ball of mud.
So they're really you're just using them in place of a library-only application in an umbrella app.
Basically, yeah. And I don't know where you would do one over the other, but maybe it's really, really separate, and then go for a bigger separation. Maybe you would start with context and then move to completely separate applications, depending on your team structure, perhaps. Depends on how many repos you want, or whether you want to do umbrella apps or what have you. Anyway, the final main feature is fallback controller. So I'll just go through this really quickly. This is a large contrived example, but the idea is that you might have lots of ways to error out in an API, for example. So this is getting a user and then checking that they have authorization to do stuff and they have a session. So the success case is fine. We create a user in this case. So we show the JSON for that in our API. Otherwise, we go, ooh, you're not authorized, and we render an error JSON. And then over here we go, do some dummy check password and say you're unauthorized as well. So there's a lot of sort of code there. It's hard to follow. What happens in 1.3 is you've got this thing called action fallback. And what you do is basically specify a fallback controller. I guess you could have more than one of them for different scenarios, like a API error case versus a web error case. It cleans up the code, basically. You can use with, and then basically what with does is it blows up with an error if you get any errors, i.e. if it doesn't match this thing. So basically you can just concentrate on doing the happy path, and then you can give it an atom to say wrong credentials, and then basically that falls through to the fallback controller. Hello. So that's the fallback controller. It's just a normal controller. And all you're doing is pattern matching on errors that could happen. So we're doing, there's a change set error, so we couldn't do that thing, so we blow up unprocessable entity. These are just mapped to normal HTTP response codes. Here we're going unauthorized, here wrong credentials, etc. So essentially you get, and these can be used across controllers. So in an API, for example, it's super useful because you're going to have that all over the shop, and you don't want to repeat yourself in every single action in every single controller. So that's pretty handy. It basically just becomes a centralized list of error scenarios. You don't have to do it just for errors either. There might be other cases where success is also like a standard response. So in an API, 201 accepted typically doesn't have a body. You're just going, yep, that's cool, I did it. Then that can be done as well. You can just send back an atom and the fallback will handle it. So that seems pretty useful. The only other notable features, and I might be missing some stuff, but...
Sorry, quick question. So the way that worked was just because it wasn't returning a con, it was returning something else other than the con?
Yeah, correct. So previously you have to return a con, otherwise it's not a plug and it breaks. Essentially, I don't know how this is doing it, but I think it's sort of wrapping this with a macro, most likely, and essentially forming like a composite plug. So this is part of a plug that may not return a con, and the fallback controller is kind of doing the rest and returning the con that you wanted. So it's sort of like a two-part plug, if you know what I mean. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I haven't looked at the code, so I have no idea how it's actually doing it, but I don't see how it could do it any other way. So this is like a partial plug, essentially. Does anyone know how that works?
I'm not sure, but every action is not a plug. It's an action that call the name action, but action is a name of it. So that's a plug. They later moves like in a pipeline on web plug. That's how it works.
Right.
Yeah, so
Because that's called from inside the action if three guys with the name delete con, so like something like that. So if it's like downstream.
yeah, so basically because it doesn't return a con, it can't be a plug. So there has to be a plug wrapper around the action to marry the two together. It seems pretty simple. This was the only other new feature I noticed. And this is pretty useful when you want to highlight the currently active URL you can get current path and current URL. Did anyone notice any other useful stuff that I've not covered? Because that was pretty much my reading of it and the interesting bits. Cool. So it is still release candidate. They've released 2 release candidates. Upgrade at your own risk. Things might change, but upgrading's pretty straightforward. You don't have to do the web to lib migration, which is probably the hardest bit. There's nothing hard in there. There's just lots of bits to do. There's a guide. It's pretty.
You go remove the web directory. That changing that was really easy. There was a whole bunch of configuration changes that were a bit fiddly.
Yeah, there's a bunch of sort of fiddly changes because stuff moves around, but there's nothing really hard in there, and nothing breaks as far as we found. And I haven't heard of anything blowing up for people. I mean, again, nothing really changed, and these are just the same functions that were happening before, just in different places. So yeah, just be careful when you're doing that upgrade. And look, I expect stuff will change. Maybe context is a weird name and they might change that. The generators are called experimental in the mix help documentation. So they are likely to change. They might change what code's generated, perhaps, in the final release. Does anyone know when the final release is due out? I mean, they probably haven't given a date, because why would they? But I expect in the next month we'll see a final, because it seems pretty solid. So there's no reason not to upgrade. It's certainly worth a try. And look forward to improving your web architecture dramatically. So here's some stuff. Lone Star Elixir talk, Chris's talk just gives you all the reasons behind this that are probably better explained than what I've done. There's a release announcement. I've pretty much covered that. And it probably is, if you want to know more about bounded contexts, taking a look at Martin Fowler's article or reading Domain-Driven Design by Eric Evans. That's it. Thanks.